It is Clayton. How are you doing today, Clayton? You doing all right? It's so good to see you. How are you? You doing all right, Clayton?
Yeah, I'm great. Yeah, it's like 6 in the morning here.
Oh my gosh, you got up at 6 in the morning to be part of the net. You are a saint, Clayton. Oh my gosh. And we got Mr. Andrew Sweeny. He's got the Gurdjieff class coming up. I'll have to ask him about that. So, Clayton, I'm going to ask you what you've been thinking about. I just finished a book called The Sunflower, which is a pretty fascinating book. And Dimitri, it's a pleasure. And the question is the following. So you're a Jew in a concentration camp, and a Nazi asks you for forgiveness. Should you forgive the Nazi or not? And the whole book is kind of exploring the question of forgiveness. And I think this is actually really critical because I'm not sure if anyone has a good answer of when you should forgive someone or not. And it's a really fascinating, it's like a 100-page book. And then there's about 100 pages of responses from the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, some philosophers, and all these. Some people no, if you forgive the Nazi, you're basically enabling Nazism and saying it's okay. There are other people that are no, if they genuinely want to change, it's okay. So it's a very interesting topic. The other thing, and Mr. Sweeny, if you're there, it's good to see you, my friend, and congratulations on the Gurdjieff class coming up. And the other thing I was just talking with Theory Underground on Marx and the logic. Hey, Mr. Sweeney, how are you doing today, sir? You doing all right?
All right.
You've got the Gurdjieff class coming up on Saturday, right? How do you feel about that? What are y'all looking to get into, my friend?
Oh, it's gonna be wonderful. Luke's a really good teacher. He's been doing the Gurdjieff work for like 30 years, and he's very he's very clear and intense. So I think it will be a nice. I think it will really be a powerful kind of experience for people. So
Divine. Well,
I'm looking
I've
forward to
enjoyed
that.
listening to him speak. And yeah, I was just saying to Clayton and Dimitri, I just finished this book called The Sunflower on the question of forgiveness. And the context is there's a Jew in a concentration camp, and a Nazi asks the Jew for forgiveness. And the question is, would it be moral or a sin to forgive the Nazi? Are you enabling evil in that context or not? And I think it's a really deep question because I sometimes wonder if when you talk about Gurdjieff, all this inner work, it takes so much work to even think through a problem like forgiveness. And then to also, here's the other thing, to be able to I think what happens a lot of times, I call it drifting. People get in relationships, they encounter someone that causes pain. And then when they encounter that pain, there's all this tension of, do I forgive or not? And maybe they forgive, maybe they don't. But then gradually they just drift away from relationships entirely. They just kind of more and more atomize because those sort of tensions are so great. Mr. Javier Rivera, it's good to see you, sir. I'm talking about a book called The Sunflower I just finished on the question of forgiveness. Generally, what's interesting to me, I feel like a lot of people use forget and forgive as similes. And I wonder if there's a danger in that because you're almost then making a virtue out of a lack of a capacity. In the same way, if humility is a lack of strength, that's not really a virtue. So there's something about forgetting that actually is removing the ground that makes forgiveness possible. But then at the same time, if forgiveness isn't forgetting, on what grounds is it not enabling an injustice? On what grounds is it a good choice? And also, I think this is an important question, then I'll pass it on, and we can talk about anything. Because I think more and more, if you have liminal web spaces forming communities, if you're going to have people hurt or you're going to have misunderstandings, if we don't know what forgiveness is, then basically all communities are fragile. All every relationship, everything has a certain sort of tentativeness to it. So what does it mean to forgive? And then, it's is forgiveness an enabling of evil under what conditions are good, and what kind of work do we have to do as a subject to even be able to discern the differences between those things? So those are all things I'm thinking about, but I'm open to anything.
Well, Daniel, I could throw in a Gurdjieffian thing for you,
Nice.
because I've been thinking about this because I've been reading these texts that he in contact with his students. He was teaching these people in World War II, during the Nazi occupation in an apartment in Paris, and some students were coming to him and asking him why they're not making progress, why they're not moving forward, let's say, in their spiritual development. And he said, because you don't have remorse of consciousness. This seems to me that you have to have this genuine remorse of consciousness before you can evolve and not become an egomaniac, and not become sort of or at least not just be superficial and vain and all these things, right? Something about so that speaks to me more than forgiveness in a way. This remorse of consciousness, rather than that's like, because I've tried to forgive people, in order that I can be humble with myself, so I can really
Well, it's interesting because there's one thing. So, Philip, we're talking about forgiveness. When forgiveness is actually, there's a way in which forgiveness enables evil. In what ways forgiveness or the conditions are good? Because if we actually don't know like something like that, which might speak to one of the reasons philosophy matters, is to think through and discern such problems, then basically all relationships are very tentative. Right. And it's kind of interesting because there's one way in which people seek forgiveness simply because they're like, they don't want to sit with the anxiety. So they go and ask, I'm sorry. And there's kind of apologizing. And then you become like steamrolled and passed over. So there's one way of saying sorry that's very bad, because then you're never kind of engaging and the relationship's not real. But then there's another way where the refusal to say sorry turns into a kind of stubbornness. And then there's also a kind of sitting in a unforgiveness that seems to become a stuck. You become very, very stuck. So what would be the signs, I guess, as an open question, of if you're asking yourself the question, should I say sorry, or should that other person say sorry? That would be evidence that what you are experiencing is genuine, or what you're experiencing is real, that it's not passivity. Like, what are the grounds of it? Because the thing I think about sometimes is we may make a mistake to think of forgiveness as a mere choice, in the same way that I think something that destroyed Christianity was making faith merely, I believe in Jesus, not a constant practice of like being like Jesus, just propositional knowledge. I wonder if there's something about forgiveness where it becomes problematic if it's just a propositional, like, do I forgive or not, versus what are the activities of forgiveness? What is
can I just have a follow-up and then I'll shut up? The other idea that I had about forgiveness is when you apologize to somebody, the other person can be totally wrong, but you still have to apologize to them in a way to free yourself. Even if you know that the other person has harmed you or done something wrong. So I think forgiveness requires an apology, but a sincere apology. And if it's an apology, it's about relieving yourself of the energy of the burden of the pain of that you've kept between you and that person.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'll pass it to Javier and then Dimitri, because it was interesting in the responses. There were some people that were like, oh, the Nazi on his bed was genuinely asking for forgiveness, but he didn't really want a relationship. He's actually using the Jew to clear his conscience. It's kind of an objectifying the Jew to say, come here, clear my conscience now. Okay, good. So they're like, nah, it doesn't count. But then other people are like, but no, he's genuinely tortured. He grew up in a situation he didn't ask for. You should extend it. And then there are some people who are like, oh, but if you extend forgiveness to overcome your blockage, then aren't you being selfish? Because you shouldn't enable evil, but you're doing it just so you as a person can move up beyond the situation. And it's interesting how you can spin it and spin it and spin it, which then begs the question, is it a matter of autonomous rationality? But let me pass it to Javier and Dimitri. Mr. Javier Rivera, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, it's good to hear. It's good to see all you guys. Forgiveness. I've thought about this topic a lot too. Derrida makes a good point in terms of there's a sort of calculating forgiveness. And that's something that you had mentioned before, Daniel, about like, I should forgive for my own ego, my own psyche, negativity and everything, or I need to forgive because if I don't forgive, then I can't be in this family anymore. Derrida would all call that a very calculated kind of forgiveness. And once we throw forgiveness in a sort of calculation of weighing pros and cons, it seems like Derrida was pointing at the fact of it's not that this is necessarily bad, but I think once we get to a point with forgiveness where there's no calculation. Calculation can't be done, right? There's nothing that can be done. And I feel like moments like this, what do moments like this actually look like, where forgiveness cannot be calculated anymore? And it's typically for acts that are just extremely unforgivable. That there is no point in you forgiving them anymore. And that, I think, is when you reach that cap of you can no longer rationalize your forgiveness. And what does that look like? You know, when Derrida talked about how forgiveness is for the unforgivable, what does that actually mean? I know people that have seemingly done it. We've heard stories about, you know, their own children being murdered and the parents like somehow become friends with the killers, you know, forgive the killers, like a bunch of things that most of us probably would not feel comfortable nor ready to do ever. But there is something there to that, forgiveness without calculation. What does that look like? And I think the danger is always putting forgiveness in a sort of element of calculation. People also tend to use remorse as like, I should forgive them as well. And that is also a very tricky element as well, because the problem that I have with remorse sometimes is at what point is this a social, like, at what point is this a construct of something that is a remorse versus a genuine remorse? And that's something that's very, in my opinion, difficult to distinguish for most people. What is a genuine remorse versus a kind of constructed remorse of kind of a socialized pressure of like, you should feel bad for what you did. And the other thing about forgiveness is we have to talk about suffering. We have to talk about how arbitrary suffering is in general, and how even giving a meaning to that suffering is also what puts us in a very difficult place. Because the moment we justify suffering, the moment we give it a narrative, it makes us, in some sense, feel better. But that's another element of calculating suffering. And in that way, we also respond by calculating forgiveness as well. So for me, the challenge is, how do we defer our meaning of suffering, giving a sort of meaning and justification for it? I suffered for this reason, and then also deferring that, calculating forgiveness as well. And again, it's not to say that calculating forgiveness is necessarily bad, but there comes a point where you cannot calculate anymore. And so in that sense, we have to talk about suffering and its arbitrary deferment of meaning. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
It was excellent comments. I'll give it to Dimitri, Philip, and then Clayton. And Clayton's up at 6 a.m. because he's a hero of the people. So well done, Clayton. And Andrew Parson, it's good to see you. It reminds me of that scene in The Brothers Karamazov, both where Ivan Karamazov is like, if God made a world where man have free will to do evil, then I want to turn my ticket back in. And then there's also the scene of the mother talking about the soldiers, killing the children and being like, I can't believe in a God that would forgive them. That's an evil God, right? But then there's another part of it that seems to be something good about that kind of forgiveness, which right there all seems to scream the need for some sort of ability of the subject to, one, go into themselves. So the Gurdjieffian class is coming up, everyone, with Andrew Sweeny at Parallax. This ability to go in to tell the difference between those grounds of, am I calculating forgiveness, or is it a genuine thing? When am I and when are I not? When am I enabling evil? When am I not? And then, if at the end of the day, forgiveness is something that cannot be calculated, you have to be the kind of subject that can live with doing something that you cannot calculate. Because then forever you could go back and say, why did I do that? And that could actually drive you crazy. All of this speaks to the kind of work that needs to be done. And Mr. Jochen, we're talking about forgiveness, when it enables evil, when it's good, what is forgiveness, et cetera, so forth, based on the book, The Sunflower. It is good to see you, sir. But let me pass it to Dimitri, Philip, and then Clayton. Dimitri, please.
Yeah, but no, I actually like that you brought in remorse, this this feeling of this deep regret that really drives you to want to be forgiven. This kind of desperation to, and then you want the other to be merciful. But forgiveness is interesting as this gesture, because I think it implies this mutual kind of limitation, Like if the other person wouldn't feel, would be like content with his own starkness and his own way, his own law, he would never be willing to forgive you. But of course, then again, like I mean, I know that Derrida has this idea about you can only really forgive the unforgivable, and I think that's how forgiveness as such requires its meaning. Like the moment you calculate it, it's not even, is it even forgiveness? I don't think so. It doesn't really seem like it. It's just like you say, it just seems like maybe like a polite more, you know, just like you know, when you just say hello or thank you and you don't really mean it, you just kind of say it. Or like you ask someone, hey, how are you doing? Well, you don't really care how they're actually doing. I think that's like the calculated forgiveness would be in that kind of category. But I'm here, guys, to ask you a question because I'm interested in the philosophy of music, and I'm really like, please prove me wrong. Like, I want to be proven wrong here, and I have not done so much research into it yet. But it seems like there's not actually so much philosophy of music that's actually rigorous. Like maybe some people go to Nietzsche, and then there's, you know, Roger Scruton. And I mean, that's, I think his line of questioning is interesting, going into the phenomenology of it. Of course, there's also an ancient tradition with the Pythagoreans, and yeah, the ancients already mentions it. Oh yeah, of course, Plotinus talks about it. But with all that's basically most of the stuff that I've read and encountered. But with all of it, there seems to be something that's missing. And you know, I don't want to be the guy who's like saying, oh yeah, it is because, you know, when you're listening to a piece of music, you're having a first-hand experience, where philosophy is just kind of a second-hand kind of thing that aims to get at it, like cutting it off from the truth. Like, I don't think philosophy should be cut off from the truth of music, even though it's not a direct experience of the melodious harmony, if that's even what music is about, because lots of music that people listen to is not even melodic at all. It's not harmonious, and it's also not meant to be. Of course, you always get this with music, that imperfections in music are very important for the piece of music to be perfect. Like you know, you have a lot of music programs, and you have a piano, and then producers work on actually not having a very tight rhythm of the different tones, so that you get a more authentic human feel that actually makes the piece of music more perfect. So something that I've been thinking along these lines is that I've been working a little bit with music production, and sometimes you create these loops of melodies that are just perfect, you know. And of course, it's a loop itself. It's a circular thing. It makes me think about the death drive, and yeah, what is also interesting, and oh yeah, I got it from some rap lyrics. It's very bad lyrics, but I think he made a good point with it. I think the guy said something like this. Yeah, she rides me like I ride this beat. It's a very bad bar. It's not hard at all, but it's an interesting point in regards to masculinity and femininity, because in a sense, you know, when I make my music, singing or rapping, I don't really think of it. I don't really make it myself. It comes to me, and the beat itself sings to me, in a sense. It speaks to me melodically in this kind of way, and then I just manifest it, whatever is there to be manifested. And this is why I'm interested in that quote, because, you know, okay, she writes me like I write this beat. And in this sense, he's saying that he's putting himself in a feminine position in regards to the beat, where the beat is like the masculine penetrative force that you open yourself up to release your overflow, your cup, which is running over. Of course, you have to then be in that kind of state of mind, which you can practice and things like this. But yeah, I think this philosophy of music that maybe one day I can actually develop in a more rigorous way has something to do with sexuation and with masculinity and femininity. And of course, like Zizek will talk about how the god in Orthodox Christianity is a feminized deity. Like it's basically the dealing with the problem of the one is intimately related to the woman question, but you can transpose it or displace it, whatever words you want to use, to the realm of God as the one. You know, you lost the one, maybe there was a breakup, you know, or fusion with the mother was lost, but you transpose it to this feminized deity in, for example, as Zizek says, Orthodox Christianity. Now, wherever we take that line of thinking, the truths of religion, philosophy, and art come very close together, of course. So there is something to be explored there in regards to sexuation or sexual difference and the enjoyment and experience of music and those types of things.
Oh, that's lovely. No, music is a wonderful topic. I'll pass it to Philip and Clayton. It makes me think Balthasar once warned that we tend to think that people choose their lives because they hear an argument that convinces of something. He says this is totally wrong. He's critiquing the Thomists. He says it's more like you're attracted into things. And he says that beauty comes before, like beauty is what convinces more often than it is actually argument. And argument is simply what we then, that's us taking the music and writing the sheet music. Argument tends to often be sheet music. That is a result of hearing a music that then we put down. And Balthasar was quite fascinating on that term. There's a few more things that come to mind. Something that always is interesting to me about music is that where if there's a mistake in a painting, it can be quite easy to overlook it. I sometimes wonder if music is almost like more naked and vulnerable in that if a beat is off, you totally like that was off, like you hear it, right? It's like very clear to you. And if that is something more like the human subject, which brings to like, why do we need forgiveness? Because like the music is off and you can't stop thinking about it. It forces your focus on it. In the same way that there's something about music metaphorically that when a note is off, you're focused on it and you can't overlook it. It also makes me think like Aslan and the Chronicles of Narnia sings reality into existence. Also, Clayton and I were talking about how wisdom is Clayton was saying, and I loved it, how wisdom is the coordination of the many into the one. When you're riding a bicycle, there are many things you have to do one thing, like riding a bike. And music is fascinating because there are many things that have to come together to make the one thing of the music. And it's almost like metaphorically it speaks to wisdom. I'll close the point and give it to Philip, Clayton, and then Andrew.
Can I just respond very quickly when you're finished?
And it's just that there's something about by not thinking music, perhaps we've not been able to think about philosophy in a non-problematic way. You know, philosophy, you know, music seems to be more akin to wisdom and more of an emotional life and so on. But Dimitri, please.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, like in how convincing the aesthetic of music can be in its beauty. And this is why I think psychoanalysis can be perhaps a proper tool, one of the proper tools to think music, conceptual tools, because there's the notion of transference. And in Lacanian psychoanalysis, you have the voice, you know, as the object A, the gaze and the voice itself has this hypnotizing kind of element to it. So yeah, but I again, this is a question to everyone. If you have any source that you think, okay, this is the go-to book, this is the go-to article, this is the go-to guy to read, if you want to know more about the philosophy of music or some thought on music that's interesting, please send it in the chat, because yeah, there's not so much that I've found that really hits the nail. And just one more point. I love when things are off. Like I love to listen to rap with auto-tune that I can hear, okay, this guy was singing very, like, how do you say it, false in the microphone, like he's totally off with his tones, but there's like just so much auto-tune over it that you cannot hear it, and I love that kind of overproduced bad quality music stuff.
Well, I can send you a whole lot of books about the debate on if there should be drums in churches or not, or if that's against the will of God, because that is a huge debate in Protestant churches on if there should be drums. And boy, howdy, you can get some fights. There is a book called The Resounding Sound that's on Karl Barth. Actually, what you're getting at, you know, the whole thing, like the phenomenology of the artist, I actually think that the very experience of art has not been central enough in philosophy. Mr. Jockin and I and Javier and the Philosophy of Glimpses talked about this. I think it's a massive problem. I think as a closing point, one of the reasons why, though, I think there's something about forgiveness here, because when you have the skill as a musician, you hear something's off, you're able to hear it and appreciate it and see how they're going around it. There's also something about where relationships can actually be stronger with drama if they know what to do with it. if they have the skills to handle it and work through, where drama then becomes something that makes it stronger. And it's interesting here where there's something about skill that seems to be very important, and how, like, when the question of forgiveness is almost, how do we get back to the music? How do we get back to the coordination of the many into one? And there's something about forgiveness, trust, and relationship that seem to all go together as if they're kind of similes in a way. But let me give it to Philip, Clayton, and then Mr. Sweeny. Philip, it is good to see you, sir.
Good to see you too, bro. Yeah, as far as music, I think it's something really worth looking to the medium. It's like super overdetermined. Uh, what does this even mean anymore? Like live music versus recorded music over New Year's Eve. Everyone doing the big national broadcast has some kind of lip sync that they're doing, and the people watching this seem to be less forgiving than if they were in person, and say someone plays an extra couple bars on a jazz solo and everyone goes, huh? They're like, oh, that's kind of more easy to forgive than someone who isn't nailing a lip sync, and like how that kind of they're both music, but they're both definitely not music, and how it just changes if you have a song that can be listened to simultaneously by a billion people. I want to go into forgiveness and sexual differentiation. That's something that feels like very, very like on an emotional level, for some reason, asking forgiveness from a woman versus a man, as well as like asking forgiveness from people of different ages, is like kind of trippy. Like if you talked about the brothers Karamazov, like, wasn't it Ivan who said something like, I don't want to live in, or there's no justification if a child ever cries, or something along these lines. I was like, what if you do something that makes a child cry and you have to ask their forgiveness? That seems to put you right within this uncalculable mode, like immediately. What if you do something like with your boss at work, and what if it then is like something between you and like a governmental agency? That is to say, you have done some crime, there is some debt, and they might come and forgive your debt. I'm actually reminded a little now of David Graeber when he talks about the forgiveness of debts, these jubilees, and it's almost in a way like we go through the process of forgiveness, and it's selfish in the way that Osho talks about it, that you can continue being yourself. Because if you don't have the kind of like clearness of the forgiveness, it's just this thing that's like looming, either in the we space between you and the person, or just within you, or just within them. And yeah, I think that gets into very interesting territory of like what's considered a crime. How far do you go with certain like negative externalities? Do we need to ask forgiveness for certain excesses, that are, everyone knows we're like probably pillaging the global south for certain resources and stuff like this? Or is it just like, that's too much, like I have to draw the line somewhere? And to finish just this, in order to kind of save what Simone Weil calls the soul, is like the space between what I am and what I love. And if you're always trying to move more towards like what you love, knowing you'll never get there, but you'll get a different proximity, how might forgiveness, allow you to wrestle yourself from who you are so you can make that journey?
No, those are excellent comments. I'll give it to Clayton, Andrew, Sweeny, and then Javier Rivera. What's so fascinating to me about the problem of forgiveness, as reading the Sunflower and the responses was, it's as if you cannot get the answer from facticity. Like it's pure choice. Like it's not given to you at all by just the information of what occurred. It's like you have to discern it. You have to interpret it. Like, you have to decide. Like, because there are ways when I can use forgive. I say, hey, Philip, you really hurt my feelings, but I forgive you, so don't worry about it. You could be like, that's not wrong. That's a power move. You're using forgiveness to get power over me. But then there's another time where I'd say, well, actually what Philip did wasn't a big job, so I'm not going to bring it up. I'm just going to forget about it. Well, should I forget about it? Maybe it's something we should talk about. Maybe we shouldn't talk about it. There's a million possible scenarios that emerge when we ask questions of forgiveness that to me is so fascinating, because it's almost like thought relating to thought. Like, that's where you find yourself. Because if we look at, like, the fact of the matter is, an event occurred. Like, if you're looking for the reason on if you should forgive or even bring it up or not, it's as if the phenomenon itself cannot tell you. You have to decide, and then how do you decide? It's a very raw question. More can be said on that, but it's one of the reasons, like, it's like you're so naked in the question. It's like, where do you turn to decide, to find a reason for if you should forgive or not, right? Because every reason you give could be brought up with a counter of, well, you could always counter whatever reason you give. So is it a raw choice? And is it at the end of the day just an absolute choice that's purely naked? That it's one of the reasons it's so fascinating in that sense. But let me give it to Clayton, Mr. Sweeny, and then Rivera. Mr. Clayton, how are you doing today, sir? It is good to see you.
It's very, very fascinating. I'm really glad to be here to make one of these. I don't even know where to start. But with the thing to do with forgiveness, and before I go to that, yes, I agree with Dimitri. I also am very interested in the philosophy of music. I was recently chatting with GPT about the philosophy of drums, like what's their point. But we'll get back to that later. So coming to forgiveness, the thing that really struck me when you brought it up was the concept of I think it's a Vivekian thing. The forgiving, like giving forward, kind of like Jesus going to the outcasts and giving his personhood to them, so they can get a taste of what personhood is like, so that they can aspire towards it. That sort of like came through for me, which then took me to it sort of felt like a bi-directionality of forgiveness, but it's more like a multi-directionality, because you're like it's an in-between place. You're trying to look back to something that happened retrospectively, and there's probably some wounding there, but trying to make a choice on the future version of that, how to move forward. And in the process, you have to give something. Like you have to give, whatever that means. In that case, there's like some gift giving of thoughts. It's like you have to give a gift towards a wound that happened in the past, so that the future may not be broken by it, in a sense. And it's very challenging, like if you start to actually think about it, because you speak of, you hear this a lot, people say forgive and forget. But should you forget? I don't think you should forget, because it's important. Like, I mean, imagine if, you forgot about the event, then it's probably going to happen again. You don't want that, especially if it comes with wounds and it really hurts. So you want to navigate that in a different way. However, the wounds, if you think about it, like in our biology, like if I think I've heard this about guitar players, like if you want to be really good, you have to develop is it a callus? So you have to hurt your thumb so much to the point that it becomes so wounded and scarred to the point that it's so hard it stops to feel, so that it's so easy to work with. So there's like a gift in that as well. Yeah, there's quite a few things coming up, and but yes, I'll just stop there for now. I'll pass it on to someone else.
No, that's brilliant. Clayton always comes up with the best images. The idea of like you need calluses to play music, and there's something about forgiveness that is the gaining of calluses needed to make a relationship deeper. There's something there that seems very important. It also seems like on the question of the philosophy of music, there's a difference between listening to music and playing music. There's a difference between participating in it and consuming it. I'm now thinking of, we just had we were talking about Marx and kind of the logic of capital and exchange. Likewise, with Theory Underground, and there seems to be a difference between a forgiveness that's calculating exchange. That seems problematic. In the same way that I'm going to be your friend because I can get something out of you. That seems problematic. Or I'm going to just experience music as something I consume. That seems problematic. But then at the same time, you cannot possibly be friends with every single person on planet Earth. So there's some standard that determines that you're friends with this person versus someone else. Is that almost inevitably going to have some sort of exchange logic to it? When is exchange logic good? When is it bad? And then it should be noted that we don't tend to forgive strangers, right? We tend to forgive people that have some sort of relation. So is the grounds of forgiveness the question of the perpetuation or the relationship or not? Should you always perpetuate every possible relationship then, right? And that makes me think of the breaking of the future, like you're saying with the past. And, maybe that's like, should you like every type of music? There's some musics you don't like. Likewise, there's some people you choose not to relate to. Is that inherently bad? Maybe, maybe not. There's questions that come to mind. Let me pass it to Mr. Andrew Sweeny and then Javier Rivera. Mr. Sweeny.
Yeah. So I think that the connection between forgiveness and music is beautiful, and you'll be very surprised when I say that for me the most profound philosopher of music I've come across was actually Gurdjieff, whose entire teaching is based on music, is based on even the tonal scale. In fact, he has this whole theory of do, re, mi, and so the developmental stages going through the notes. And then the first three are easier, and then there's this quantum leap you need to pass, which is do, re, mi, fa, which is the semitone and all this. And he was also a composer, and he had this idea. This also relates to the masculine and feminine, because he had this idea of wholly affirming and wholly denying, and so the music is a constant tension between affirming and denying. And if you listen to his music, because he was a composer, and I think Hartman, it's very interesting because it's so simple and strange. You can never actually get a pulse in it. It always eludes you in some kind of a way. So I found myself listening to it and not knowing what's happening to me, and then just bursting into tears, for example. And the way he wrote his book, Beelzebub, was he had a very definite musical score in how he actually composed it. So it's a book that was written not for your conscious mind, but for your unconscious mind. And in other words, that would have the same kind of effect on you as music. So people say he wasn't a philosopher, but I'm not sure if I agree with that. And I keep coming on the fact that Gurdjieff is this sort of guy who has been is undiscovered and will become more important, in the 21st century, as people understand the depth of what he was, what he was after. And the other thing he said was that, that people defined his music as prayer. So in a way, I think that the purest form of music is a kind of prayer. That's how I look at it anyway.
That's a lovely comment. I'll give it to Javier Rivera. It is interesting that there seems to be a long tradition of music and religion and prayer, et cetera, so forth, as if music has some kind of attunement, some sort of attunement to that of which is present but absence lack, is something we talk about, Mr. Jockin and Javier, and different things. And it's interesting too, where if indeed there is something, because I'm just thinking back on this kind of exchange logic, where if indeed there is something increasingly the case where AI is the logical exhaustion of the logic of capital for Nick Land, which is exchange logic, then the more and more we're going to have to take seriously things like, okay, what is music? What is forgiveness? What is the subject? Gurdjieff, beauty, and different things, because these all seem to point to a logic outside of capital for Mr. Marx, a logic that is not mere exchange. But then, of course, what is the basis for that, and what the heck is it? Because it seems to be more invisible or there but not there, lacking, like a cheese sandwich that you want that's not there, so it's lacking, it's not nothing. Likewise, there's a sense that there is some sort of attunement to a way to interact with human beings that is not mere exchange based. One of the reasons why I think thinkers like Gurdjieff, subject, beauty, all of these things are going to become more, and I think you see this on the people on the liminal web returning to these kind of thinkers, is because if with AI you're increasingly approaching a certain exhaustion of the possibility of living simply according to a low order causality logic or an exchange logic, and you're saying, oh wow, if we just follow that through, we become basically machines. Well, then we have to think according to escape the Nash equilibrium, of which that is, we have to think according to different logics. And that seems to be what music, when you really are in it, you attune to. And likewise, I think friendships, when they really have that feeling, feel like getting lost in music, right? They have a certain time speeds up. There's a certain attunement. There are increasingly more and more questions that we increasingly find ourselves having to ask. What is this attunement that points to some sort of alternative mode of operation, because you're at a kind of end of history of the exhaustion of capital following like a Nick Land? So I think things like Gurdjieff and beauty and all that become increasingly forced upon us if we're going to indeed be able to maintain humanity in a non-reductionist manner. But to do that, we have to face questions like what is forgiveness, pain, harm, all of these things that have happened to us that we've done everything in our power to avoid because facing them is so difficult. But now we're at a point where we can't run from them anymore, which is both good because it calls us to a higher standard, but then it's also begging us to be pathological because it is so difficult to take those things on. So I think that kind of work is very, very important. And that's fascinating with Gurdjieff and music. I did not know that. That is outstanding.
And also the notion of soul, right? So his whole philosophy is how to develop a soul, which is how to be in a state of attunement, attunement and harmony with existence, right? Which isn't a symmetrical harmony or static harmony. It's a kind of tension. Yeah.
Oh, 100%. I think that's beautifully put. I mean, there's a way in which a soul is not something you just magically have. One has to earn it, in a sense. One has to work it through and attune it to things like goodness, truth, and beauty, and so on, by facing these difficult questions. That's beautiful. Let me pass it to Javier Rivera and then Mr. Thomas Jock. And Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, again, there's a lot here. Obviously, I'm gonna have to evoke Martin Buber today, because I think it's important. The logic of exchange for Martin Buber would be exactly the categories that we've been talking about. How do we deal with forgiveness concerning AIDS, sex, gender, everything else? That is all very what Buber would call object-related relationships, primarily because those categories are reducing the human being to a kind of objectification. The other category that Buber raises to us is the I-thou relationship. How do you have an I-thou relationship? Well, the problem with I-thou relationship is that it can't really be calculated. It can only be a kind of turning towards the human being. It's like actually a kind of spontaneity, rather, a kind of openness. But the first thing that is required actually is the vulnerability of the meeting. And I think whether you've been hurt, either you're the one asking for forgiveness or you're the one demanding for forgiveness, we're both wounded in some type of fashion. It's probably pointless to ask someone for forgiveness for someone that doesn't even feel an inch remorseful. But then again, we still have to ask this question: what do we do with that wound? And this is where wounds become swords very quickly. But Martin Buber, in The Way of Man, he sets out that the heart question, the heart-searching question, is what are we hiding from? I think forgiveness as a central question is something similar to this. What are we hiding from? And what do we want the other to reveal to us as well? But the problem is we can't force people out of their hiding. That's what's so difficult about forgiveness, is that we feel wronged, genuinely feel wronged, and we want somebody to admit that, atone for that, and they won't because they're hiding from themselves. But then also, that very atonement that we want may also reveal how we are hiding from ourselves by virtue of this exchange, by virtue of this demand. Because I think people might even conflate forgiveness as justice. Forgiveness, to me, is not a sense of justice. You can have justice without forgiveness. That's very clear. The law system, everything. You don't have to forgive anybody for anything. The law will take care of that. You succumb them to the law. What is forgiveness then for you on a fundamental level? What does that actually do? And I think we actually use forgiveness as a subjective way of navigating a kind of justice within our interpersonal relationships, right? Like, I'll forgive you if you prove to me that you won't do this anymore, right? Like, again, that's a kind of atonement that you're already putting on the other person. If you do this, if you take the time, if you do your time, then I will forgive you. Again, I'm not entirely sure if forgiveness should be equated with justice. I think it's a part of it, but I think a lot of people look at it as like, once justice is served, then I can forgive you. Possibly, maybe. But we reach those points where, especially with suffering, we get at impasses where if you feel like you were wronged, but they feel like they were wronged, where do we go from there then? Where can justice be served then? And that's probably the most difficult question, because now forgiveness comes in, because there's nothing you can do with an impasse of somebody believing that you wronged them and you felt like they wronged you. And that is something that is so difficult to deal with. And I feel like that's when we have to just like grapple with, like, tarry with our negativity in the most pure sense. And it's so brutal because you want to blame someone. And it's even more, I think, in more of our common relationships, once you really start talking to somebody, you realize that your anger, your frustration was a misunderstanding, and they misunderstood you too. And then you realize, what do I do with all this pain and anger? Because I am so angry and upset. I don't know what to do with this pain. And yet I know if I blame them, it's just a fucking lie. It's a lie, because they misunderstood you. You've been misunderstanding each other for years. And then finally it comes out. You know how painful that shit is, that you've misunderstood each other for years? And you can't even ask for forgiveness, because why? But something must be forgiven, right? In some sense. And it's that kind of wound, in my opinion, that are the worst kind of wounds. The worst wounds are the ones that you can't even blame anybody anymore for. You reach the pinnacle of that negativity. There's no one to blame anymore for that pain. And what do you do with that pain? I feel like that's where the question of forgiveness comes in. Where do you place it? And I'm gonna leave it there.
That's outstanding. I'll pass it to Mr. Thomas Jochen and Philip. It's fascinating to me because, some thoughts that come to mind. Is philosophy the training to handle vulnerability? Because, a lot of people say they want vulnerability and to be open, and then when they are, they just happen to never talk to you again, or it's too difficult. Like, there's something about philosophy as abstract system building so that you can avoid the world, but then there's a way of thinking through questions of what is forgiveness, to know how to do it and to how to receive it, and then what exactly are we doing when we forgive? Because what's so strange, why forgiveness is fascinating to me is because, one of the people who replied in the Sunflower was Dennis Prager, and I wish Hyrud was here because he was talking about the difference between Judaism and Christianity, where, you had this guy who committed crime, and the only one who can forgive in Judaism is the one who the crime was committed against. And if someone is murdered, there is no possibility of forgiveness because the person is dead who the crime was against. And there's this idea that you had a cardinal go to a prison where some people committed murder, and the cardinal said, God loves you. And he's like, this is completely perverse and basically evil. actually. And it's interesting to think of the difference between forgiveness in Judaism and, say, Christianity, because like he was pointing out, for many more Jewish people, the idea of should you forgive these murderers, the answer is just obviously no. And it's not even like a resentful thing. It's just like a legal, it's just like cause and effect. It's like no. And for the Christian, it's obvious, just as obvious that you should forgive for many Christians. And that's why this is so fascinating to me, because of that obviousness for one side that it's wrong and obvious for the other that you don't. And there are questions of, can you forgive things that aren't done to you? You know, he was talking about collective guilt. Is that even a thing? You know, what exactly are we doing? Because, and it's like we're forced to ask this question because there's pain. And it's like, what do I do with it? I wonder though, if there's some ways we're seeking forgiveness, if there's something about the mistake of searching for a transcendental ground as well. You know how in philosophy, it's kind of like if you search for a transcendental ground, it's kind of a waste of time or it's very problematic. And for David Hume, you end up auto-cannibalistic. Is there something too where you're like, I want a final transcendental ground to get rid of this pain and it's gone forever? And if that's the mistake, as opposed to forgiveness being the I'm choosing to engage in the practices and actions to work through the pain. Live thought, not sure, but I'm wondering if there's something about forgiveness in terms of an autonomous rationality that is problematic versus forgiveness as a certain activity, which maybe it is the choice just to relate to someone. And maybe sometimes it's okay not to relate to someone, but it's not where you're choosing to be unforgiving. You're just saying, I can't relate to that person because I have to work through those pains. So it's almost like a mistake might be that the choice to not relate to someone is automatically assumed to be unforgiving. That may not follow. You know, there may be some other things to be thought here. But let me pass it to Mr. Thomas, Jock, and Philip, and then Clayton. Mr. Thomas, Jock, and good to see you today, sir.
Good to see everybody. Yeah, I mean, I wish Dimitri was still on the call because actually it's funny. I wanted to know what he meant by not rigorous. I mean, that's what I was really curious about what he meant by that. I was going to ask him about that point. Because actually I started putting in the chat some notes from it. There's Guido of Arezzo, who in 1100 basically was writing systematically about a lot about music. And I thought some incredibly interesting notes about it. And this is the kind of that was kind of a non sequitur from him, but I'm going to tie it into this whole discussion of forgiveness because I actually do think they relate to one very important part from Guido. He talks about it. So harmony in music is figure over time, right? So it's these notes that are arrangements over time, and that's super critical. He had a really important note that it's the last note that completes the figure. I would definitely make the statement that I don't think forgiveness is justice, not even close. It's mercy. It's a complete transformation. It's a transfiguration. In the act of forgiveness, everything that occurred in the composition and the arrangement has been transformed. Complete. It's transfiguration. And, you know, the general comment, even from, you know, because Daniel made the comment that, you know, Judaistic versus Catholic, actually Christian point of view, and even an Islamic point of view about it. You know, it's funny because we think this act of forgiveness is for the other, but it's actually not. It's for yourself. Because the point of the transformation is the removal of the wound of yourself. It's you transformed it. And usually the way that's required to do it is some kind of higher, because all this discussion is very primary order, like a first order relationship. It's a second order relationship that's required. There needs to be something that both parties are correspondent to that can do the transformation. There needs to be something there. Either be a virtue, a principle, or God, you know, whatever, take your pick, which one it's going to be. I would say that's probably something that's going to happen. So for example, you know, this discussion of like the figures of being wronged. Yeah, you can keep going down that pattern, right? But the point is you can choose in an act of forgiveness to transform that into something else. And I wrote in a note, I mean, it is true. One level of the discussion is a question of contrition. It's a lot easier to give forgiveness when the other party's contrite. Now, you still don't have to give that person forgiveness, but it certainly gives you a little more reassurance. But that's why I'm bringing this higher order property. Contrition only really works when you are self-judging. There's a measure onto yourself, right? That you hold yourself to some standard and you realize you've missed the mark wildly. So actually, Daniel's point about philosophy's purposes, yeah, there's a mode of abstraction, right? You're just going into the universe and not applying to yourself. That's always the greatest challenge, right? So great. We're so easy to reflect on others in the outside world, and then put that measure just yourself is the hardest thing. I think that's one of the main differences, I think, in training of philosophy, right? Is that measure you're developing, this abstractional measures, outward facing, or is it actually the first thing you're doing to yourself? Because that measure of contrition is requiring onto yourself that you missed the mark wildly. You murdered, you raped, take your pick. You did some evil. And that's you're self-judging yourself and self-correcting yourself, right? Now, this can go into whole neuroticism and like, granted, I'll accept those points. But I'm just saying, in one mode of forgiveness, it's generally a lot easier and justified, if you can use the justice point, if there's a if there is that contritional element. But the point is, forgiveness can happen without that. That's why I'm bringing up this mercy distinction, because it feels justified in justice to give forgiveness when the other side is in contrition, because you're being given now, oh, I can trust you because there's a higher order judgment you're placing on yourself. So I don't have to be the judge of you and hold you to that standard. So that's probably where that operation comes in. But you still can give forgiveness even without that, even without contrition. But that's an act of mercy, and that's for yourself because of the transfiguration of the temporal measurement of what happened to you. I also just bring that up because in music, especially, a lot of music is about anticipation and expectation, which is what emotions all about. I mean, we've discussed a couple of weeks now, right? So this nature of pain is a discontinuity of expectation to reality, whether it be in physical pain, whether it's a response to a stimulus, getting your arm cut off, or a wound of some kind, physical wound. There's a datum that something's happening to your body that's damaging you, and your body's pain receptors are telling you that something's wrong. Or the emotional, spiritual pain of woundedness of a divorce or separation or some kind of betrayal. It's the same kind of property in that way, which is pain. Pain is a sign of that. So music has, I think, a very clear role to play. In fact, the best music always does that. They play with expectations, anticipations. Some of my favorite music does that. They'll have a certain rhythm and momentum going, and then they pause. There's one, I'll put a link to it. I forgot which song it was. I know what link it is, but they stop it at a very particular point and hold the silence, and your brain tingles of the power of the silence. You're like, oh, and then it keeps, it's fantastic. But anyways, I'm just bringing up these points that there just seems to be operations of definitely a figure of time, and forgiveness is absolutely a transfiguration of it. Just like a great note or an absence of a note or holding of a phrase can completely transform a composition of music as well. So I do see a similarity in that play, just what I'm hearing from everybody. That's all for me.
I really like that idea of anticipation. I'll pass it to Philip and Clayton, because it's almost like in the act of forgiveness, you're saying, I'm willing to put myself back in the place where I can anticipate. Like, because it's like when they hurt you, you anticipated something and they thwarted it, they hurt you. And to forgive says, I'm going to put me back in the place where there is anticipation again regarding our relationship, which then may suggest that forgiveness is the act of relationship. And maybe, because it's interesting to think, what is the mechanism that when you choose to forget something causes some sort of transformation of yourself, like you were saying, like change of yourself? And it's almost, I wonder if it's not so much just the propositional knowledge, I forgive the person, as it is the courage to re-enter the space where you can be hurt again. And so what's changing you is there's an act of courage there. And I wonder if possibly a lot of the mistake or confusion with forgiveness is a result of thinking of it as a propositional choice independent of the choice to re-enter relationship. Because the re-enter relationship is like the David Hume common life, concrete and Hegel, bringing it to something concrete, like in the same way that, again, I think what has really hurt Christianity is making faith a propositional position as opposed to faith being something more like faithful day in and day out. So then you could say things like, for Simon, when he's asking the Nazi, when the Nazi asked for forgiveness, he actually is grounded not to give forgiveness because the guy's gonna die and there's no possibility of relationship. It's not that he chooses not to give forgiveness. It's that since there's no possibility of relationship, you can't forgive because you need the act of entering into relationship in order to then face the courage. Now, there would then be a question of, was Simon unwilling to enter into relationship, which may cause a sort of blockage. And it's just that the facticity of the Nazi dying makes that impossible. But there's something about forgiveness as transformative on the self as seemingly being tied to the willingness to enter relationship and thus to have courage. And you could also say if the Nazi was asking Simon for forgiveness, but actually was unwilling to have a long-term relationship as a friend with Simon, then it was exactly what one of the critiques was, where the Nazi was just using the Jew for forgiveness to cleanse his soul, and that was wrong, right? So that was something that people were saying. So there's something here about the willingness to enter relationship and regain the mode of anticipation that seems to be the act of courage that has transformation on the self to help you move from that blockage. So there's something about the relationship, and then I'll give it to Philip. And I'd also say if there's something about philosophy that has to come back on a reflection of oneself, this would suggest that only those who go through the hard way of Gurdjieff can actually do philosophy, because only those kind of people have gone through the work of the subject to have philosophy come back on themselves, as opposed to philosophy be escapist. So it's interesting to think that there is only a certain kind of subject, which then speaks to why Socrates and Plato has everyone going through the gymnasium before, going through the training before doing philosophy. And perhaps one of the reasons we have so much what David Hume called bad philosophy is you have a lot of philosophy by people who have not gone through the gymnasium the hard way or the challenges. Therefore, it becomes a pathological form of it, and it gets stuck ultimately in exchange logic. But let me give it to Philip and then Clayton. Philip, please.
I'm skeptical whether or not there is a possibility for forgiveness without common life. That is to say, no Nazis if there wasn't 1914, and this shocked the soul of man so much, sent him kind of scurrying in an atomized existence, kind of begging the question: can a wrong life be lived rightly? And sometimes wondering if what we're doing with this anticipation has some kind of a relation with plausible deniability, which is to say we build tools of manipulation that we know are going to harm and make relationships with people damn near impossible. And then after the fact go, well, I don't know if there's any way we could have known that this would have happened. And that would be one of those low order causality ways of thinking that may have kind of like a maximum ROI. And I wonder sometimes if there is a way to forgive capitalism as such, and if that's necessary before some kind of new relation to whatever the mode or the means of production can come about. And I don't even know what that would look like, but I wonder sometimes what the relation between grief and forgiveness might be. If you have to go through, like what Thomas was saying, this transformative journey that may, I don't know any better word, but like ask the assistance of supernatural love to kind of like come down and do this thing. And then, like, if you're asking to do it on a big scale, how do you know that everyone's going to get on board? And a couple people are just like, oh yeah, let's definitely do this. And they're like, gotcha, suckers. But also, is there a difference between kind of like individual, subject to subject versus like bigger group to bigger group forgiveness? And is that something we have a precedent for? Something we need to use our tools to maybe, make the impossible possible?
That's beautifully put. I'll give it to Clayton. I mean, there's a few things like one of the reasons, like what capitalism does, Marx talks about how exchange value compresses, flattens, and different things. Well, actually, we as human beings, it's almost like that could be a good thing for us because it's so difficult to handle encountering people on full terms. So capitalism's like, no problem, I'll compress things to just kind of an exchange value. But here's the problem. When you only deal with exchange values, you then get in the habits of only taking exchange values. So then you lose the ability to, like a zip file can open. If we could compress and then open, that would be great. The problem is we get in habits of keeping it compressed. we're then trained by the exchange value and the low order causality, then it's flat and we can't get out of it, and now we're cartoons. Like, we're flat characters and we can't be full subjects. But also, it should just be noted that capitalism and kind of turning things into numbers, like, a way to look at that is how God's hiddenness in Dante is to keep Dante from being reduced to ash before he's ready for it. Like, the logic of exchange helps us interact with people in a less full way so that we can actually move to the place of handling more of them, right? But the problem is exchange value gradually becomes the only value, so it's no longer a hiddenness for a gradual processing to the fullness of the real of the other person. It just becomes way easier to just stay in the simplified vision. But the problem is that by definition then turns us into flat characters, disembodied intelligence, and then the logic of capital is the technical singularity, as Nick Land says. So, there's a reason the logic of capital comes into place to make us able to handle one another so that we can work to the place where we can handle more of one another. But we've separated the logic of capital from a Dante-esque process of getting ready to handle more of the real in the fullness of being. So therefore, it's become tyrannical. It's become autonomous, right? But this also might suggest why I think there's a point to be made where forgiveness seems like it is impossible without common life, in the same way that philosophy without common life becomes self-effacing because it has nothing to ground it in. That's what I've been interested in, just reading The Sunflower, and then I'll give it to Clayton. Like, everyone has great counters. Like, when you just have self-relating logic outside of a common life, there's really good reason not to forgive, and there's really good reason to forgive. Well, David Hume identified that's exactly the problem with philosophy outside of common life. It can never tell you what to do. It always can come for a justification of whatever position you want, and you end up like the Burdian donkey. Philosophy always ends up like the donkey between two equally sized piles of grain, and you can never make a choice because there's no reason to choose one or the other, so the donkey starves to death, right? I wonder, in the same way if philosophy makes us all end up like that donkey, if that's actually what happens with forgiveness outside of relationship and common life. And then the issue is we have not used exchange logic, and this is where we end up with the Nick Land problem. We have not used exchange logic as a ability to handle common life at a gradual process so we can handle more of the subject of one another. We've used it to then just stay there, but then that's flattened us, versus prepare us to handle more of the real, like Dante's God hiddenness prepares him to handle more of God's grace and glory. So it's like we've not used exchange logic to make us able to handle more. And likewise, we've not in our common life used that as a space to be able to handle more of the real of other people. Now common life is just like, David talks about, it's the space after work where you just consume stuff and it's just garbage time, as they talk about, as opposed to a space by which we have the time, energy to handle more of the fullness of one another. So it's fascinating what you're saying. Let me give it to Clayton, Andrew Sweeny, and then Javier Rivera. Clayton, please.
So the thing that's pointing out for me now is the asking. So the Nazi asks for the forgiveness, but it's not clear what they're asking for, right? Because there's a hiddenness, right? They're asking for something that they haven't really specified. It's like a compound question. It sticks out for me because I find that, at least in relationships, what I've noticed is it's always easier to resolve conflict when you reveal yourself. So if you start off by revelation of the context where you're coming from, then it sort of specifies what is being dealt with, like which specific aspect of this, conflict or wound or whatever is in question. And going to the thing you're pointing at, being oversaturated by the spirit of the other, it starts to overwhelm you. It's you love them. you care about them, so you can't throw them out. So you have the job to go in there and sort of like figure out at which point is the real issue. And going back to what Mr. Jokin was saying, so you have to start with yourself. Like you have to really look inward before you can go outward. And which still brings me back to the multi-directionality of the whole forgiveness scenario. Because you're trying to reconstruct a tear in the fabric of that relation. It's like something happened, it's dying, and something must be done, or else it actually dies. And it's, well, in some cases, it's coming to that point. Like, you know, you're trying to negotiate about something that is probably driving you towards a divorce. And this has like serious life-changing ramifications if it goes through. So you really, really need to look into it seriously. Otherwise, it is going to literally rip apart life or lives. So I guess before asking, you have to know what you're asking for, I guess. And I don't think, like, even when you ask, how you ask matters. Like, you probably are not going to get what you're asking for. So you have to know that before you ask. It might be related to justice, like the motivation for when you ask. It may be you believe that once you get this, it is going to it's going to make everything whole again. But I don't think it ever works out that way. In my experience, it never works out in that. It's never the same thing again. It's like it's more of a scarred, it's like an experiential scar. It's like an experiential scar. It's like you had this experiential wound, and now you had to patch it up, and now it became an experiential scar. So whatever happens in that relationship, it's definitely not gonna be the same again. It moved into a different direction. I was having a conversation with a friend, a few weeks back, and we came to this point where we said, like, there are things, like, you have to be careful with your speech, because there are things you'll say to people and they completely change who you are to them forever. It's like, I used to know this person in this way, and then one day they say this, and they've never been the same to me again. And yeah, like, it's not like you don't want to relate to them. Probably you may not want to relate to them. But how you're going to relate to them is now going to change. Like, maybe it draws you closer to them. Maybe it draws you farther from them, because they said something, all of a sudden you feel you need to respect the COVID spacing rules more when you're dealing with this person. But yeah, those are some of the things that have come to me. And it's very, very interesting, the relationship to mercy and how all that links back to trust. Yeah, there's a whole theme going on here about wounds and emotions from the last few talks. Yeah, thanks.
It's an excellent comment, and it makes me think of, I think you're exactly right. Like, you can at any moment say one thing to someone, and a friendship or whatever you've had for 10 years is gone, just like that. And it's extraordinary. And there's also something about, I guess you could bring in, what's the difference between forgiveness and understanding? Like, someone says something to you and they didn't mean it that way, and you just have to be understanding that we have different hermeneutics. Like, there's so many, like, art forms, like cooking. Like, you got to know what's going into the plate when you relate, and you got to think through that. And I'm also like, it just makes you think, to me, like, if indeed so much on psychoanalysis arises because of the problem of negative speech, the fact of speech that is hard, or that makes you encounter the real, or hearing things you don't want to hear, given that we live in a world where we no longer share givens, belonging again and all that, then the likelihood of negative speech, or speech that we experience as negative, is very high. And so the likelihood of us having to confront the question of forgiveness, or the difference between forgiveness and understanding, or when do we bring something up or not, is now probably going to be a question that is very much more likely for us to encounter more regularly, where maybe when everyone shared givens and they had the same kind of ideological framework, misunderstanding was less likely, right? I'm not saying it didn't exist at all, but the regularity of the question of forgiveness may increase and misunderstanding with the loss of givens. And if there's a question of forming a liminal web or alternative communities or all these other stuff, then since those are not going to share sociological givens, it is basically inevitable that misunderstanding occurs. And if there is not preparation on how to handle it or how to relate to it, then it's basically a ticking time bomb before things blow up. And it's, and there's more to be said, but I'm going to pass it to Andrew and then Javier. The other thing I was saying quickly is it's interesting because it's almost like if you're asking someone for forgiveness to escape your pain, as opposed to asking for forgiveness to relate to them regardless if your pain goes away, that seems to be a big difference. Like, am I asking for forgiveness because maybe the pain never goes away, maybe my hurt never goes away, maybe my guilt never goes away, but even if it doesn't, I will continue to relate to that person. And interesting enough, it's almost like the only possibility of your guilt going away is making a choice that you're not doing because you have a guarantee of having your guilt go away, which, by the way, you can't think or it doesn't work. So there's some, it's like, we were saying last week that the saint has to never think of themselves as a saint or it doesn't work. It's almost like the choice to ask someone for forgiveness has to never have the expectation that that will make your guilt go away or it doesn't work. It has to be the restoring of the relationship regardless if the guilt goes away. But very often when we ask for forgiveness, perhaps we're asking out of it, not from a place of restoring the relationship, but to free us from the guilt, which at the same time, it seems true that you need to ask for forgiveness to escape the guilt. So how does one do it without it being calculating? And that seems to be the same problem of the saint that doesn't think of themselves as a saint, or the ones who chooses to do something without guarantee. It's a very strange paradox that we as humans require. Let me give it to Andrew Sweeny and then Javier. Mr. Andrew Sweeny, please.
Yeah, that's hard because you have to do it without the expectation of any kind of result. I would say, like being redeemed or not, right? Or solving the problem. Like, it seems to me that I've fucked up relationships when I've tried to make everything okay. And the more I try to make everything okay, there's a hidden agenda of trying to make things better for me. And that just goes into a kind of cycle. What I was thinking about also is just this idea of, okay, what is the cause of war, right? Because this is, I guess the Christian answer is that forgiveness is the remedy to war. And then why is that the case? There's probably something true about that. And I think then my next thought was, war is, we remain in a state of war when we're always on the defense, when we're always trying to defend ourselves, and we're looking for evil outside ourselves, which means that we have to see the evil within ourselves. Like, we have to see how evil we really can be, and really, are, and our inadvertence, our ignorance, our casual cruelty that we do to children when we don't mean to, things like that. When you try to kind of program your children to be respectful or something, and you're cutting their wings, and and then who's to blame for all that? It's like, is it you to blame, or in a way you have to take the blame on yourself? In a way, you've inherited all of this mechanicalness from the world you're living in, and all this ignorance, and so I don't know. Krishnamurti would say that every person is the cause of war, right? And I also think of the scene in the movie Little Buddha, where the Buddha realizes that he is the evil one, and that is his enlightenment. His enlightenment is to understand that he is the cause of that. That's a very profound kind of that's a very profound kind of transformation, which takes place, which is a total inversion of everything. It's the inversion of you as an egocentric being in the world. And it's very hard for us because we have so much pride and we're so defensive of our territory, and we're always trying to get ahead, and you know. So I think this whole deconstruction of our ego leads us to understand that everybody is sort of worth forgiveness in the sense because everybody is ignorant. You know, like if you could forgive the Nazi guy, it's just because he's ignorant and he's lived his whole life in mostly in ignorance, and that's led him to, you know, why would you even condemn or blame ignorance if it's just ignorance?
No, that's all excellent, because it makes me, there is definitely something that it's very important to take seriously, the reality that you're a monster. When you take that seriously, that you too are a monster, it's easier to then not be self-righteous. Like, and I think that, and Jacob Kashir, good to see you, sir. And I feel as if, like, when Christianity stresses we're all sinners, that's kind of what it's tried to get at. You know, it's like, don't be so quick, you know, to think that you're better than other people. And I also think if you take seriously, for example, stuff like we're all trapped in irony, we're all trapped in a logic of exchange, we're all stuck misinterpreting one another, these all become grounds to reinstigate relationship. And because you go, well, you know, as long as now again, there's the question of, because there seems to be a mistake on being like you get to the point where it's like, well, no matter what somebody does, you should forgive them. Well, that doesn't seem right, because then forgiveness is meaningless. Like, or then it's just kind of like it's a given ought. Like, is there no evil that a person can do that can't be overlooked? That seems problematic. And what Prager was saying is like, well, the Judas position is that they say, let God forgive. You know, that's up to God. You know, you don't need to worry about it. And there's something about that kind of seems correct, in the sense of, if you step into the question of should I forgive or not, outside of the question of will I enter a relationship or not, it seems to fall victim to the autonomous rationality, where it can't find its own grounding and it goes everywhere, and it just leads to pathology. And then actually, Mr. Tyler Murphy, good to see you, sir. We're talking about the question of forgiveness. Actually, in that way, then someone who hurts you can almost cause you a second pain, in that you're hurt, and then you're hurt where you're stuck in a loop, never being able to figure out what to do. And there's kind of a pathology that comes from that, which could be avoided if you simply ask the question to forgive someone is the question of stepping into a relationship or not. And if I can't step into a relationship, then it's not that I should forgive or shouldn't, it's that I can't forgive because I'm not in the condition where it's possible to step into a common life or relationship. Since that's not there, I shouldn't worry about it. And so there's something there that helps you anchor it so you don't lose your mind. Also, I think the question, let me pass it to Javier. I think the question of unforgiveness is tied to the question of anger. Like, how do you deal with anger? And I think for me, as a practical note, I've often found that the best remedy for anger is not the question of will I forgive the person or not, but doing something courageous. Like doing something courageous when you feel angry seems to be a big deal. If you're like mad, the courageous thing would be to go talk to them again, actually. Not necessarily asking, will I forgive them or not, but re-entering relation. Because you could do that without asking questions of, should I forgive them, should I not? Because that almost becomes an endless philosophical thought experiment. You just lean into the anxiety. You lean into the difficulty, and it's kind of courageous to go back into that place.
Or not. Also, like the opposite is also true, because sometimes you're in a perverse relationship.
Oh, sure.
That you have to end, you know, you just have to not continue.
And that to me
that is another kind of courage, just to step out of it.
I think that's very important, because instead of then asking, should I forgive or not, which then the problem is if you say, well, I'm not going to forgive, then you're the bad guy, because it's kind of like bad not to forgive. So really the problem is with forgiving or not is it's kind of a false choice, really. Like, to be unforgiving is bad, so you really can't do that. So it's kind of like forced to forgive. But then that seems like where the Nazis can take advantage of people, right? So it seems to be the better way to think about it is, will I relate or not? You know, and just to ask that question, am I going to enter a relationship or not? And sometimes you shouldn't enter a relationship because it's toxic, and it's easier for people, I think, to understand that. people know that there's such things as toxic relationships, and that sometimes it can be better based on your own absolute choice to choose that. But if you ask people, is it sometimes better not to forgive, you get confused. Because it's like, well, no, I shouldn't do that. It's good. It's bad to be unforgiving. So you end up in an autonomous rationality where you can't figure out what to do. And basically then you're forced to, even if it's enabling evil, you can't discern. So that's where I think asking the question of, should I relate or not? And then that just being the question can help one avoid some of the pathological confusions that can emerge. So I like what you said there, Mr. Sweeny. I'll give it to Mr. Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera, please.
I think part of this question too is, for me, anger at the very bottom of it is always despair, in my opinion. At least every time I've worked through my anger is always a very painful sadness. Like, it's such a despair, like, honestly. And I think that's probably the most brutal part of realizing, like, you going from anger to reaching that just bottomless pit of despair. And that has always been like the most painful and also transformative experiences for me, because you realize like you're so angry, but then like after you get all your blabbering out at this person, right? You've diminished them, you've made them beg, you've done the worst things ever out of your anger. You realize that you're just fucking sad. And there's nothing they can do about it. You know what I mean? You know, I mean, I had a similar conversation with my mom, and my mom said, "I'm sorry." And it was like, not enough. It was not enough, not enough. And yet at the same time, you reach this point where, you know, at least in my own personal relationships, you start to realize that the person you're so angry at is also so helpless. Like, they're so helpless. Like, they didn't even know what you meant. They didn't even know what you were experiencing. You tried to express it, you couldn't express it. I mean, with child-parent relationships, I would say generally good parents always try to do what's best, right? That's the typical paranoia. I'm just trying to do what's best. The child is trying to express himself with a limited, impossible vocabulary. And as a parent, you're trying to play charades, right? And nobody knows that you're traumatizing the other. Like, you have no idea. You have no idea. You have no idea an innocent conversation or a simple correction will frame that personality of that child forever, because that's what the child understood. But again, you didn't even know what you did when you did that, right? Like, it's like a very hard reciprocal understanding of like, what did you actually take when I said that don't do this? Did you take like this as like don't express your feelings, or did you take this as like, you know, a certain, you know, what I've noticed with children is that there's a very like low level, they don't have complex distinguishments. And so when we say things, they take it almost as like it's all or nothing, right? And it's just a tendency. It's a tendency. So it's very hard to relay sophisticated distinguishments of like, it's okay to be angry, but also you don't have to like hit people, right? But if you say something like, don't let your anger overflow you, the child might be like, so you're telling me to suppress my emotions, right? Like, again, it's a very subtle distinction of like, it's okay to be angry, it's okay to express your anger, but don't let it like completely manipulate you into doing horrible things, which is a very subtle distinction, and that's very hard to teach. What does that actually mean for a child? The other thing I want to get at is, can forgiveness really be taught? Or is it simply imitated? And I've really thought about this because I feel like a lot of us ape forgiveness. Like we ape it. Like, can you forgive me? Yes, I forgive you. Like, I don't really, because there is no explicit objectification to ascertain that you have actually forgiven someone, that your parents have forgiven their parents, that your siblings have forgiven, you know, it's just almost like a trust, a kind of faith that this person has dealt with this pain and moved on with it. Not forget, but simply moved on with it, carried it. And I struggle with that, because it's like, how can you teach a child forgiveness? I mean, you're told forgive, say sorry, everything else. to the point we start aping it because, well, that's just a way to have easy relations and not tarry with the pure negativity of it all. So I struggle with how it can really be taught in some sense. And then the same thing with can we teach vulnerability? Can we actually teach vulnerability versus aping vulnerability, which I feel like a lot of the online space has done, like ape vulnerability. And what does that actually mean? Because vulnerability is definitely a much more courageous act than we have typically given it to be. The other thing is about evil and goodness. The Hasidic conception, at least the way Buber understands Hasidism, is that evil is on the lowest rung of good. We cannot know evil without good. But man is there to be able to do good. It's that capacity to do good. And I also think that Julie Resch's understanding of forgiveness as dying is another important understanding, because I feel like people forgive without understanding the brutality of that act. Like, are you ready to die? Like, are you ready to die when you do this? Because if I'm going to forgive a Nazi and they turn on me, I already laid my bed. Like, I understand that I can die, not only physically, but also psychologically, I can die. So I hope when people say forgiveness or really do forgiveness, I hope that they're ready to die. I hope they know what it means that when you forgive, you could be betrayed again. It leaves you open to that pain again. You could, but are you ready to die? And that's the question that leads to transformation, but also death multiple times. And it's always different. And I think some people, I think they forgive, but they don't understand like the brevity of that situation. I think the people that are truly angry understand it in some sense, because it's like, no, I can't forgive you, because forgiving requires a brutal death of our own ego, our pride, everything like that. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
There's a lot of wonderful thoughts. I'll pass it to Clayton. Well, there's a bunch of things, because it's almost like we focus a lot on the question of like forgiveness or unforgiveness, and there's almost a pre-step on the question of self-righteousness. Like, if people were less sure that they were right, that seems to, like, it would go a long way right there. Like, why do we get so hurt is because someone thinks they know what's best or is right, and then when they see that they're hurting you, they don't stop, or they're very sure that they're right? So there's something about, one of the things that philosophy can teach you is not to be so certain of yourself, to be confident, not nihilistic. And it's like, that seems to be really important. So it's almost like we need to focus on humility, and not in a kind of passive way, but humility, because once you start talking about forgiveness or unforgiveness, it's almost like it's after that question, which then if you re-enter the relationship, but you still have self-righteousness, then it's only a matter of time before it occurs again, right? And so there's something about, again, it's almost like if there's something about the question of forgiveness, independent of the question of relating or not, that ends up in a kind of topsy-turvy, back and forth, autonomous rationality, then there might need to be more of a focus on humility, realizing we don't know what's best, realizing our parents were just doing the best they could, our children realizing that we're just doing the best we could. And as long as we don't have an attitude of self-righteousness, and maybe this is why religions can emphasize pride is so problematic, that seems like it goes a long way. Maybe one of the things that makes an accident turn into a deep pain is self-righteousness. Like that's when it seems to go to the next level. If someone hurts us and then we talk about it, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry, like it's a misunderstanding. That doesn't tend to be the stuff that leads to these big questions of forgiveness. It's they hurt us and they're like, no, I didn't. And from a real self-righteousness, that's when the problem comes. But then it's like really weird, because if you're asking to forgive them, you're asking to forgive someone who doesn't even think they need forgiveness. So then that's part of the burden. There's more to say. Clayton, I'll pass it to Clayton, because you said a really great question on self-righteousness. So Clayton, please.
Andrew said something that I forget, but what came up for me was something to do with this higher esteem. Like, we seem to always have this assumption of a higher good in others. So that always leads us to a disappointment, because I guess we're overestimating in a way. It's like, I expect you to be good and perfect and not do something to hurt me. And then you did. How dare you? It's like, how dare you drop below the standard of good that I expect of you? And so then you have to go to, you sort of like have to get to a point of forgiveness, you have to accept that the person you need to forgive, sometimes it might even be yourself, that was not as good as you assumed them to be. And that's okay. And if you're gonna forgive them, you have to accept this new version as being the one you're gonna move forward with. It's like, oh, I thought that, I don't know, for lack of a good example, it's like, I thought maybe you knew how to do a certain thing well. I can't find a good example for it to fit in there. But yeah, you knew how to do this thing well. Or maybe you were good at making meals, right? Then I learned that you were not. So it's so I have to move forward with you now accepting that I shouldn't have no expectation of, and I don't know, like, so you have to take on that disappointment and accept to live with it going forward. Which then brings me to what Javier was talking about with it sounded more like developing a relationship maintenance framework, because like forgiveness is sort of like something like that. It's like, because the picture that comes to mind is like there's this little pin that is sticking out somewhere, and every time, you know, a relationship is happening, it always slightly rips through the skin of that relationship. And so it's like a little cut, like a mild cut that keeps deepening every time it passes by. So this person does this thing and it's slightly annoying in a way, but it ever so compounds and deepens the cut. And until at some point you start bleeding and then go like, oh, wait, I'm bleeding. Why am I bleeding? It's like, oh, wait, there's this thing that's been happening. And you may assume that because now you notice the bleeding, it's because, you know, that pinprick is there, but it was never in that moment that you bled. It had been there for a while. And so if you could always pay attention to that and sort of like fix it before it gets to the point of bleeding, then maybe we may not need to get to a situation where we actually have to do like a huge forgiveness. You know, because people easily forgive small things. It's like, oh, sorry, I forgot to move this cup of water that was next to this computer. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Oh yeah, people can forgive that, but they may not forgive the cup of water next to a computer that got knocked over and poured into the computer and crushed it, because now there's a big ramification of that. But we could have forgiven it when it was before the catastrophe happened. So, which takes me back to the relationship maintenance. I think to sort of like suggest something for Javier in terms of how do you teach that? As a parent, I'm struggling with this. It's like a real challenge. Like, how do you teach it? Because it's not something you can't impose it. It's more like it feels like you have to hold a space for the spirit of vulnerability. You have to hold a space for the spirit of forgiveness and then act it out, and really demonstrate it to the point that it's deeply embedded as a way of being for like these young humans who are developing, such that they just do it. Like we have this thing I do with my children. We call it trying to maintain the spirit of kindness. And so the question is always, are you being kind when somebody raises their voice? The person who raised their voice, it's a question to them, and the person who got raised voice at, it's a question. It's like it's asking both of them, are you being kind? So, well, are you being kind to yourself? Are you being kind to the other? Are you being kind to the other people in the room? Are you being kind to this whole community? Because when you meditate upon that, then you may see your part in it. You may see how you're not being kind, and at least that you may have an opportunity to address. And we try to sort of like, my son, he would challenge it because like, yeah, I think I'm being kind, but why should I care about kindness? Like, well, if you kill the spirit of kindness, then you will eventually kill love, and if you kill love, then you sort of like kill God, and you don't want to kill God. You want to have God around, and you want to have love around. So maybe it's really important to work on the spirit of kindness and maintain it. And so it's through, I'd say it's through participation, by holding that space. Like, at least that works. If you demonstrate it and you hold the space and you participate in it repeatedly and keep maintaining the relationship, there's a chance that you may not need to get to the point where you have now to deal with the forgiveness question. It's sort of like you have to actually prevent getting to the forgiveness place by actively forgiving the small conflicts that are continuously arising before they compound into something really huge that may actually break the relationship. Those were my thoughts. Thanks.
I think that's excellent. There is definitely something to be said about dealing with the small things so that you're prepared, practiced for the big thing. And if you weren't able to deal with the small things, what are the chances you're going to be able to deal with the big thing? Right. And I definitely think, it's almost like there's in the same way that in Belonging Again, we talk about the difference between earning trust and just giving trust. It seems like the problematic forgiveness is where you say you need to earn my forgiveness. Well, then it's a power dynamic. And then the problem is people too often been like, well, you should just know that I don't like cream in my coffee. And you brought me cream in my coffee. And people do this. It's just like, and it's like, well, that means you don't love me. Because if you love me, you would have known that I don't take my coffee with cream in it. And so I'm mad at you. And then the person like has to earn your forgiveness. That seems very bad. That seems to be just as bad as earning trust. And that's where you're saying I'm hurt. And it's funny because you say, well, you shouldn't be. That's a small thing. Like there are ways where you can get hurt and you shouldn't get hurt. Like you're just being difficult, right? But then if you're getting hurt when you shouldn't get hurt, you can frame it as you're owed forgiveness. So this seems to be very problematic. That form of forgiveness, just like that form of trust, is very problematic. But then there's another kind of forgiveness that seems to be relational maintenance that actually seems to almost require a long-term plan, like thinking small things along the way, being able to discern, is this a big deal or not? There's also something bad about forgiveness if it's like, well, I need forgiveness to relate to that person. That's almost like needing love. Like if you need love, then that's pathological. Likewise, needing forgiveness seems pathological. And instead, if we think of forgiveness as the act of courage to re-enter the relationship, whether you need it or not, the question is, did you do the act? That's why it seems like so much is tied to the act or not, because if you don't act, are you going to enter the relationship or not? You can always just spin it as somehow like, I need forgiveness, they ought to forgive me. And this is what's so interesting to me, and then I'll pass it to Sweeny. I really think that many, many relationships are destroyed because the people get in autonomous rationality situations they cannot escape. Because they look for a transcendental grounding to determine what to do, or they look for a final justification. And as we learn, this is where philosophy is useful. Philosophy can teach you that that's not possible. We tried that for 2,000 years. Can't really do it. In fact, everyone now is talking about relationships, right? Rather it be Vervaeke or, Lacan, there's this emphasis on relationships. Well, that's really useful because then you start saying, okay, stuff like forgiveness or trust or love, all these things, rather than looking for them in terms of a transcendental grounding, I need to think about them in terms of what is the corresponding act of relationship that then goes forth. Because if relations are ontological, then it's about entering acts of relationship or not, because you determine it's a toxic relationship, right? So it's almost like many couples, friendships or whatever, get in huge trouble because they're trying to deal with problems like hurt in terms of looking for a autonomous rational solution, a transcendental grounding. And since you can always spin it, you just end up in an eternal topsy-turvy world, as opposed to asking, what is the action that is forgiving? And, you know, like I said, I think it has a lot to do with doing the courageous thing, the act of courage here. But let me pass it to Mr. Sweeny and then Javier, and I have about 20 more minutes. So let me pass it to Mr. Sweeny and Javier. So Mr. Sweeny, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Ivan Illich's definition of or meditation on the nature of philia or friendship, where he says that friendship is the ability to bear the unbearable in a person or something like. And I thought that was very beautiful, and that is love when you do that. And that's the opposite of kind of killing God. And then I had an image of, you know, Clayton was talking about killing God, and then I had an image of, you know, Gurdjieff used to walk around the streets of Paris with candies in his pocket, and he would give them to children, and he would do that just to have the spontaneous reaction from the children of, like, these were nice, expensive sweets, you know, they're not like cheap candies, and he'd give them, you know, he'd spend half of his salary on these sweets to give to children, and then he said something about how bad their education is, and the education is bad when the parents say to the children, "What are you supposed to say now?" And they're making a formula out of what should be a spontaneous love. Like, as somebody also said in the chat, love is beyond law, right? They're making a law where there should be love, right? So again, I think that's where forgiveness is profound, when it's based in love and not something like, I have a reaction when you say it's something you educate your children to do. It's not something that can ever be an imposition on them. It's something they have to learn. Yeah, they have to learn to go through that difficult process in some kind of way to find to know where virtue is in friendship and bearing the other person.
No, I think it's a beautiful statement. There is something like, in the same way that it's like educating forgiveness, you could say educate, like, oh, this is how you do vulnerability. You know, you were talking about Javier aping vulnerability. That seems problematic. You know, there's like, oh, I'm going to educate you to find your purpose. There's a lot of that now. That seems problematic. Like, it's very interesting. Oh, or even like teaching music. If you teach music in a very sterile way, that kind of sucks. You know, you got to, like, you don't really learn music until you learn that improvisational ability, which requires going through the more exchange logic or low order logic, but then it's not just stuck there. And it's so interesting because it's like, when it comes to teaching forgiveness, it's almost like, whereas math, maybe you teach kind of linearly 2 + 2 = 4. Forgiveness is almost like you have to just create spaces of figuring it out on your own. Like, you create environments where they stumble around. It seems more architectural. And I wonder, but like, and it's interesting as well, because like, if you don't create those places where they find it on their own, then they don't develop the situational reasoning, because that seems to be a lot of this, by which to discern when a relationship should be extended or not. They just learn a script from you about what you are supposed to do that will probably leave out 99% of the situations that they encounter in life. And then when they go in there, they won't know what to do, or they'll try to overfit the script that you gave them, which then leads to all sorts of troubles, and they get taken advantage of by someone or something like that. So it's interesting because it does also, like Clayton was saying, it's interesting because, like, when it comes to forgiveness or relationship, there's something about transparency that seems very important. You know, Ray Dalio basically says radical transparency is how you make a business succeed, like constant sort of transparency. There seems to be a lot of truth of that. But then I also wonder if it's easy to be radically transparent when we all share the same business and we have that to mediate one another and we both have to come to work the next day. as opposed to a radical transparency with someone that may just leave. And also, I think we all learn through life that if you're radically transparent with everyone on any times without sort of warming up to or condition, then it can cause problems, right? And then the probably could say, well, that's their fault. Oh, okay. So, it's not that you did it wrong. You can always blame them. But all of these speak to some sort of situational reasoning that, to me, I just find Dante's model so useful, of this gradual movement to handle more and more grace, more and more transparency, more and more vulnerability, more and more relationship. And then I think now we're just in an age where if we're relating so much online, it's not clear what the etiquette of this kind of warming up is, especially if it's going to be a public YouTube video versus private. But then if you keep it all private, people aren't seeing how to do that kind of skill. So how do you do that? What does it look like? There's a lot of questions here on the etiquette of online spaces that is not self-evident in different ways. But let me pass it to Mr. Javier Rivera.
No, this is great. I like what Andrew said here about unbearableness, which is actually my gripe about people advocating for polygamy and polyamory, because I'm just like, are we actually certain that you can really bear one individual to their fullest capacity when we say that, no, I believe loving multiple people is possible? Like, I am just so skeptical over that claim that it's possible. I would say the moment that you are fully able to love someone in their full unbearableness, then mankind can the love for mankind can slowly come into the picture. But this abstraction of like, let's just love mankind, like I just have to laugh. Like, most people that say this don't even love their own fathers. Like, I mean, like, you can't do it, and I have to laugh. I mean, it's so, and this, even the liberal agenda, it's funny because people don't see the difference. Like, the logic is the same. A lot of the logic is the same. We're just debating values, but the fundamental logic that's underneath, that undergirds them both for the most part, is the same. It's an exchange. It's, I want to eradicate this antagonism. It's unbearable. And so when we talk about tolerance, I don't even think people really know what that means, because there is nothing to tolerate with the unbearable. It is pure unbearableness. The reason why we came up with formulas is to cut that unbearability, right? All this sort of sayings of, social norms and social normativity to navigate human anxiety and the abyss of despair. But in my opinion, until we get people, and I agree with you, Daniel, I think that the roundabout to my question about can people really learn forgiveness, it was actually, people can learn to get acquainted with uncertainty. And I think there is when forgiveness and those questions start opening up. What does it mean to be humble and be uncertain and everything else? I think that's when it starts opening up, and I think philosophy can do that. Even Buber said, like, philosophy is there to break idols. It won't help us maybe find a god per se, because Buber is very adamant that was the kind of idiosyncratic, kind of spontaneous thing, a meeting of per se, a genuine meeting with another person. But philosophy can help us break our idols, and that's what we have to do, a lot of idol breaking right now. The problem is that I see with most people when I have this conversation, is that people that don't read philosophy or not acquainted with it, is they get irritated and they get offensive, because what they feel like is happening when we say these things is that we are undermining their pain. And we can't undermine their pain.
Oh no, I think that was really well put. Oh, are you getting pizza? Oh my gosh, it looked like they were bringing in pizza. Frick, man. But actually Michelle has done an amazing soup, so it's going to be a great evening. You said a bunch of really wonderful things, and if anyone has closing thoughts, please. I love what you said on mankind. There is that wonderful part in the Brothers Karamazov where the guy comes to Father Zosima and he says, Father Zosima, I have sinned. for I loved mankind and in the process lost the ability to love an individual. You know, Dostoevsky was very critical of the notion of loving mankind because basically that's an abstraction in which you project your fantasies, your ideologies, and so on and so forth. So we do have to be very careful on anything that might love mankind at the expense of loving particular individuals. There are quite, like when you're saying with polyamory, that would be another topic. There is something on what is the difference between polyamory and polygamy. It seems to be the presence of children. It seems to be that you start opening to multiple streets and different things. I think we have to ask questions of what would it look like for a world with multiple wives, many children? You know, is that a level of reality, you know, that people can handle, you know, different things like that. I would say, as just a note, I think the challenge, like when I listen to people talk about how polyamory forces you to encounter certain jealousies and spiritual deficiencies in yourself, which I could see as certainly occurring. I think actually also friendship can be a realm of that if indeed we go into the places of dealing with these questions of relationships on that deepest level. But there is something to be said about polyamory. I think what polyamory does in kind of rising in this moment, it makes me think of basically Nick Land on like showing the inadequacies of the logic of exchange. Like, it's like, oh, actually, most of us treat marriage as an exchange thing. We have a logic of capital that we're using in marriage, and actually it's hiding jealousy, and we need to break that up. In the same way that Nick Land is like, okay, fine. If the only logic is the logic of exchange, then let's just end up in AI, baby. And so if people want to reply to Nick Land, or people want to reply to polyamory, then it requires a different logic of marriage that I think gets into things like music or beauty, or different ways of interacting that are able to operate according to higher dimensions, which again, most people haven't thought. They get upset at Nick Land, they get upset at the transhumanists, they get upset at polyamory, but then themselves are still operating according to a logic of exchange that can hide them from their wounds. So I think there is something that has to be sublated from all of this that really does speak to us being able to operate outside of a logic that hides us from our wounds to one another. But then what is the process by which we can handle more wounds? How do we go about that, et cetera, so forth? There's more to be said, but let me pass it to Mr. Jockin and then anyone else with final things to say.
Yeah, I mean, just to close. You know what's funny? So what I'm hearing from all of this, I'm reminded of Mina, where the discussion happens. One of the questions they have to ask is, how do you teach virtue? Now, Plato doesn't really, he purposely obfuscates what he means by that because he doesn't make a distinction between intellectual or technical virtues versus the moral virtues of temperance and courage. I'm just bringing it up, circle back here, because what's happening in this discussion I'm hearing right now is the justification and the kind of affirming of the moral virtues of their importance, especially courage. You know, it's funny because courage generally kind of gets thrown in there, just like the battlefield version of it. This is a very different mode of what we mean by courage. Not the normal mode of it, because it is true that I think the ultimate question here is what Daniel is bringing up, which is that willingness to re-engage, to enter into a space of with tolerance, as Javier is bringing up, to kind of in a space of radical brokenness or radical indefiniteness, having some state of safety. Where is that safety coming from? Because that's basically what the problem here ultimately comes down to. We need some mode of safety. And if it's not coming from transcendentals, and if it's not coming from givens, and it's not coming from abstractional notions, we've argued all three are not going to work. What do you have is for your courage? Where is it coming from? And I guess you can go in Nietzsche and just radical self-affirmation. I don't know, dog. I don't buy that. I am not convinced on that. So, but I do point out that I think that is what I'm hearing here is the kind of culmination that something related to courage is required that cultivate these moral virtues. I said, and maybe the connection is with temperance from Plato. It's in Phaedrus. It's a very interesting translation of it. Or some, I talk about it in my course. It's an argument about temperance as the informed opinion for the best. It's not temperance as the mode of just the median, right? Obviously not excessive nor defective. It's a really interesting discussion of what temperance is. Just like this discussion here is a really interesting reframing of what courage is. I'm just bringing this up because I think that's kind of what we're culminating with, of what exactly needs to be cultivated in this mode of forgiveness, right? As kind of a virtue to be developed It seems to be a moral virtue. It seems to not be teachable in the same way technical skills can be taught, like mathematics or gymnastics or whatever. It's something else. It's a moral virtues, and it seems to be related to temperance and courage. And it seems to be articulated in these kind of two ways. One, because you have to have that stability of safety in a space where you radically don't have it. And second, it's a kind of, I didn't even say this out loud, so I'll say it now. Generally, that act of forgiveness has to be because there's something more important than the figures in front of you. There has to be some affirmation for the best. There's something that has to be higher in the assessment that, yeah, I could choose to stay in this vicious state of resentment and anger, and I might be fully justified to do it. But there's something more important than this that I'm willing to sacrifice for. Just like there's time preference sacrifices to demonstrate our moral virtues, because your choice of where you choose to sacrifice your time for, it's non-returnable. You get one shot at it, and it definitely tells you and everybody else what your character is by what you choose to do. We're here talking this conversation. You could be doing a bunch of other things with your time, right? That's a demonstration of something very clearly about you, because you're sacrificing something you're never getting back again. The hour and a half, 2 hours we've been here. No different than an act of forgiveness. You're saying in that self-killing, you're giving up those figures that you had perfectly every justification to stay in, because there's something more important that you're affirming to. Now, again, what is that? Is there any way that that's not theological in nature? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. That's what I'm kind of taking away from all this in the end. So, Daniel, it's been a great conversation so far. Really appreciate it.
You're a beautiful soul, Mr. Jock, and I'll pass it to Philip. And again, if anyone has final things, it does, in the same way that forgiveness seems almost like a pure choice, of which is the choice of courage. It's almost like courage is the pure choice at the ground of the moral life in different ways. Like so much seems to ride on courage, and we've emphasized the good often, or what is ethical, and should you forgive or not. And it's interesting to think if actually attuning to like the good, the true, and the beautiful has a lot more to do with questions of courage. Now, courage is not the same as the absence of fear. And I'm not ready to say that if you do something courageous, it is therefore good. But there is something here about really kind of focusing on courage as being important, as a kind of at least framing of the field in which decisions should be made. Maybe you have 3 choices, each one that you're afraid to make, but at least if you know these are the 3 you're afraid to make, you can cut out the other 20 possibilities and focus on those 3 and then bring in wisdom or something. So it's interesting as a heuristic. Let me give it to Philip, Javier, and then Mr. Sweeny, if you'd like to speak, please. Philip.
Yeah, speaking of heuristics, just to relate it to physiology, if you want to anchor it just in that and say that the precondition of that is a certain amount of physical well-being, strength, etc. That's not to say that people can't do miraculous things when they're very sick, in the sense of courage, but courage does tend to favor those that are bursting forth with life energy. So I wonder how much, before you go into the more like scalpel like analysis of this, just kind of like broad brush, forgiveness as medicine, forgiveness as a way of, the life force to run as unencumbered as possible, seems to be an interesting avenue to explore.
I think that's excellent. I'll give it to Javier, and then if anyone else wants to speak, you can just unmute. It makes me think that we've tried to do morality without thymos, right? Owen and Peter, a lot of people have talked about thymos, and we need thymos. And it's interesting to think if thymos and courage are somehow related, that really it's very difficult, because it seems like thymos is tied to the courage that is needed for the kind of subject that can then discern questions of good, true, and beautiful. So that, the Francis Fukuyama thesis could be problematic, even though I greatly sympathize with some of the notions of trying to disable thymos as opposed to addressing it. But it may, in that act, make it not possible to have this bursting that seems so important. But that's that, I know Raymond and Joshua Hansen and all them do that, but let me pass it to Mr. Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I'll try to keep this short. I like Philip's question about the life force. There's sort of like a broad stroke. I think it's there. I think it's like the same poison is also the cure. The question is, how do we turn that? How do we turn that? And for me, it's found in understanding the endless abyss of that pain and suffering. Because to me, that's also it's also the same force that propels you in that infinite resentment and that infinite, sort of anger and unforgivableness. It's there. That energy is there. The question is, and I think in some sense, I always loved the Job story, and I think Zizek did a good account of this, is like everybody around you will give you a justification. That's also the social dynamics of it. That's what's so hard too, is that we don't just experience pain in isolation. Others don't like us being in pain, and they will tempt us to be like, they fucked up. Don't forgive them. Don't do this. And it's the same Job trial, right? Where his friends are like, well, if they didn't do something wrong, then maybe you did something, right? And it's that constant temptation that we're going to be faced with. And the question is, can we defer it? Are we courageous enough to defer it? Are we courageous enough to not give it a certain meaning, a sort of one and all meaning of this? Thomas talked about the figure of time. That's probably the most problematic thing about anger, despair, and my partner even like sarcastically quotes me, and she goes, well, if you bring in the problem of time, but it's true. It's true. When you bring in the problem of time, we are left with an abyssal question of like, what do I do with this pain? The energy force is there, like Philip is talking about. The question is, are we willing to, at one point, cut it off? And I think that cutting off is like a death, a transformation with the wound. You don't get rid of the wound. I'm not so, I don't have hopes for healing, but I think healing can be understood in a different way. Healing as a sort of understanding that this is a transformation of death, that death also gives forms. And I'm thinking like resurrection of Jesus, right? Like his wounds are still in his hands. Like that's what's so amazing about that whole thing. And then people are bewildered by the fact that the wounds are still in his hands. So I think there's a lot there, but for me, I think it's trying to get people to turn to that. It is very hard. I mean, I don't think you can even teach this to some degree, but getting them acquainted with that abyss, that actually if you face this abyss, you see there's no end, right? Like you could despair forever. That's the spurious negativity right there. And at one point you have to trust. At one point you have to turn, right? Like when Clayton brought up his child, like, what's the point of kindness, right? It's a spurious question, but you will quickly find out if you don't have kindness, you're suffering all the time. You're angry all the time. You can't do anything. You will discover very quickly that there's an abyss to this question. And it's best to not even go there. But at one point, you have to go there to understand that there is no out of this hole. There's only a transformation of this hole. There's no out of it. And I think that's the hardest thing to teach, to relay, because we can be skeptical. We can always add criteria, temptations to justify, give a narrative. We can do this. But the question is, what is that really doing for us in the long run? And are we, is this justification just a way to deal and make the pain bearable by having someone to blame, by have a eternal image to smite constantly? There it is. I said image, Jock. I said it. I agree with you, Jock, and I agree with you. It's the image, the eternal image that we feed and scapegoat ourselves to. So I'll end it there.
Outstanding comments. And it's very interesting on what you're saying about anger. And it's almost like undirected anger becomes resentment that then seems quite problematic. So is there a way to connect anger that actually becomes a very powerful source of motivation? I have thoughts, but does anyone have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm occurred to me that I agree with Thomas about the fact that we can't just go in. I can't remember what you said, but it was something to do with The kind of Nietzschean solution of, God is dead doesn't respond to this problem, and leaves a gaping hole. And so I was thinking, and I was also thinking of what Javier said about killing idols and how we need to kill a lot of idols. And then I thought about what Philip said about clearing sort of clearing the ground. So I think the act of forgiveness is a way of clearing the ground in some sense, and it's clearing the ground so that we can learn to worship again, right, rather than just stay with the abyss. So I want to introduce the notion of worship here, which is a very unpopular kind of notion in many circles, and doesn't seem that philosophical, but it seems to me that at least in my heart, that if you don't have that, if you don't worship something, then your existence is is full of poverty, in a sense. So how do we turn back towards worship? That's what I'm left with in this consideration.
Well, this has been delightful. You guys are so great. I think worship is very interesting because that also speaks to a kind of action. Worship is not merely propositional knowledge. It requires a certain action. And it does seem a lot rides on a certain action that we have to engage in. And, a few thoughts come to mind. On this point that Javier is getting at, on you always have reason to be angry, there's this lovely essay by Agnes Collard where she says, how to be angry forever. And the argument is the following: the thing that makes you angry happened. You can't go back and change time. Therefore, you always have a reason to be angry. And so the idea there, actually, in a useful sense, is if you're looking for a reason not to be angry, by definition, facticity cannot give it to you. It can't. So there's a kind of raw choice that has to be made. She talks about just kind of the relationship of mutual value that calls the anger, then choosing to kind of steer the anger in a way in a new direction, or to look in a different direction, right? But it's very interesting because her point there is that when we look for reasons to not be angry, or reasons to forgive, or different things, well, the facticity cannot give it to you. And so that's why there's something snake eating its own tail here in a problematic way that we're getting at, where instead the question is, I feel anger and pain, how should I act? And this is, I guess, when I think of myself, like, Clayton and I were talking about your work. And Clayton was like, this idea of your work. What is your work, right? Like, is it like community, marriage? People have different works. And part of the problem seems to be anger without a work. Because then you have an anger that you can't sublate into a motivation to do the work. And so you're stuck with an anger you sit with, you don't know the action to do with, and so it becomes resentment. Because your work also helps you figure out what relationships you should follow and which you shouldn't, not from a bitterness, but simply, like Mr. Jockin was saying, a time management issue, right? You can't relate to everyone all the time. You have limited time. But if you know your work, or the thing that helps you attune with the true, the beautiful, and the good, the things that help you be more courageous, well, then you can use that as a heuristic to determine which relationships you should do or not. And it's very interesting is that without that sense of your work, as we talk about in the conversation that comes out tomorrow, and Clayton is lovely. He also gave me the bike example in the frickin' apathetic walking stick. Oh, I've used that like 5 times now. Oh, I love it. So like finding the apathetic as being more like using a walking stick as opposed to seeing it. Clayton, gold, man. And so there's something here about the problem of anger, which I think is basically the problem of unforgiveness, having like an inability to turn into a motivation in a constructive way without a sense of your work, because then you can't even discern what relationships to have the courage to lean into, even if you're hurt, versus which ones you simply choose not to, not from bitterness, but from simply the reality of finitude and limited time in different things. So like I can speak personally, and the reason why it's almost like you have to channel the anger is because if you always have reason to be angry, then there's always an anger there. So the question is, can you sublate it, right? Because you can't make it go away, but it's as if you can change the anger to stop being experienced as anger and instead becomes like a kind of passion or drive or something else. That's what's energy. It's like the same energy that at one time is experienced as anger when directed towards your work, then actually becomes maybe more so intrinsic motivation or different things. Like I can just think of like I had a TA in a class who basically I argued the exact opposite of what she argued in a Dickinson's novel. She gave me the paper, it was like a C. And I had no problem. It wasn't getting a C that was the problem. I felt that the reasons he was giving me a C were not good. Like they were just simply from a kind of ideology. And so for me, it was like, all right, well, I'm going to write the greatest paper you ever read. You know, fine. I'll get better at writing. Fine. I will have such a good paper that you won't be able to live with yourself if you give me a C, because you'll have to acknowledge it was from ideology, right? So it became a motivation to get better at writing. This is what I think happens. I do think anger has to be directed towards skills, not personal. Like it wasn't like I hate this person, she's cheating me, and I'm angry at her. That seems to be the trick. To take the anger and not direct it at the person, but direct it towards some sort of skill or some sort of way to force yourself to then do something that leads to motivation. Mr. Jockin, please.
To ask, I mean, did it work? Did you just call the virtue of the excellence of your writing to actually convince her to release her ideology? I'm just curious. Did it actually?
I at that point decided it might take 20 years to get to that place. So the jury is still out, so, one day she'll be like, man, I shouldn't have given that guy a C, actually. So one day I've still got 10 years left. I did end up with a B though. So maybe it got better, but it's funny how I think anger can become intrinsic motivation if you don't direct it toward the person, but direct it toward what do I have to do to remove all plausible deniability that that person is actually being unfair to me? So what are you doing? You're kind of in a way getting back at them, but not in a personal way, but from a removal of plausible deniability. You see, to do it so well that then they have to mirror on themselves. And I don't think that's vengeful because it requires something of you. But Mr. Jockin, please.
I cannot help it. I mean, you're making that's a claim to justice. That's what you're doing.
Yes.
You're basically obliterating any chance. Like, how could you, out of justice, you must be compelled by justice to acknowledge the rightness of this action. Like, that's what I'm hearing right now. I've been there too. That's also why I'm reacting like this. I apologize for interrupting.
I definitely think in that situation, going, what can I do to make justice undeniable is a way to sublate it. Like where you're basically going, instead of I'm resentful and that shouldn't have happened to me, it's be like, how do I make it plausibly undeniable that that shouldn't have happened to me? That is a call on you now. That's a kind of thymotic call on you. And then actually because you can't help but have experiences in your life, especially when you're young, that make you angry, right? But if you know that's a way to do it, then as you get older in life, you then actually can train to motivate yourself in more intrinsic ways or more value-based ways. So there might be something here also on how can we take experiences of pain and anger that are then there and do it and then act in response in a manner to increase courage, to increase intrinsic motivation, to increase thymos kind of drive to get better at a certain skill or a certain thing. How do we use it to be a call on ourselves to rise to an occasion of the hard way, of the kind of subject that is capable of greater capacity as opposed to live in resentment? Because if you go down the road of resentment, then you are letting them hurt you a second time. Not only did they hurt you the first time, but they're hurting you and then you're in paralysis. Don't let people that have hurt you twice. Rise to the occasion. So with that, I do fear I'm late, but it has been a pleasure, my friends. I've enjoyed it. It was good to see all of you. Thank you for your time. Clayton, wonderful to see you. Mr. Sweeny, lovely to see you. Thomas, Jockin, Philip, and Javier, always a pleasure. Thank you all for coming by. You're beautiful. May you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Daniel. Bye.
It was a pleasure. All the best. All the best.